Chapter 9. The Elder Tombs. We bards cherish what little is left of the good folk, the Elayna. We may share a common language with the Durians, but we keep alive a few of their words. Some to mark our Keetish speech as different, some because they are our secret words of power. But the legacy bequeathed to us was more than a few old words. Yesteryear's experiences pass to history, and history passes into myth. A wearing journey that erodes the truth and leaves us with mysteries. Was the monastery originally built by the Elayna? Did the Elayna scour out what the orcs now call the bitter sands? Did the Elayna understand the mystery of the Blackstone itself? What we do know for sure is that they built the Elder Tombs, older than history and forever cursed. Jorwin Weaver, The Keetish Cycle. They followed the trade road north across the plateau until the low winter sun touched the tips of the Guardian Peaks. "The plain of the Elder Tombs," Jorwin whispered theatrically. They paused to gaze across the desolate wilderness to the distant palace tombs of the good folk. The mountain range behind them swung in a great arc from south to west and then to the north. The jagged peaks created a vast wall of cliffs and crags that penned in the clouds so that they piled up over the plain. There, in the grip of the ancient eldritch power, they churned, casting the tombs in the shadow. Whatever power was interred there would occasionally ignite the gloom with forks of sickly purple lightning and send snarls of thunder rolling out towards them. "I've heard such tales of this place," the bard continued. "Blessed divine, I can feel nature's disturbances even from here." Kerne set their direction with a chopping gesture, and we must cut right through it. "What?" Leusios stopped dead. "Are you mad? We should circle further north and east. No one goes through the plain." "It is a fearful place," Vibnia agreed, soft yet steely. "But in this case, Kerne is right. We cannot afford the time for such superstitions." She raised her hand and drew a circle with her finger. "The divine watches over us for the sake of all humanity." Leusios set his weight back on his heels and folded his arms. "I'm not afraid," he lied. "But why take the risk?" "Because what Hothrog told me tallies with what we learned from the bandit camp. Taeneas will ride out of the mountains tomorrow morning. The ambush will happen then." Kerne gestured to the boiling clouds over the plain and spoke more urgently. "The wind is rising, and that's dangerous. The sand on the plain is as sharp as briar thorns, and when driven by a gale, will scour flesh. We'll be too exposed on the road, so we need to make as good a distance as we can, as quickly as we can. We take shelter and rest when the wind gets too dangerous. Then we march on before first light. Any longer route risks the murder of every Durian accompanying that gold shipment." Leusios still had a little stubbornness left. "Not if we travel through the night," he argued. "Then we could take the longer loop around." Kerne gave him an impatient look. "And arrive exhausted and unrested. We'll be in no fit state to fight. We go through the Elder Tombs." The half-orc strode off without waiting for any further response. Vibnia was quick to fall in at his side. Leusios opened and closed his mouth. Kerne had never taken command like this before. The pride of beating another orc senseless must have gone to his head. He coughed when Jorwin gave him a slap on the back. "Well, I've always wanted to walk amongst the ancients," the bard declared with false heartiness. "But from the stories I have heard, I think Kerne is a little optimistic about getting any sleep." The Elder Tombs were huge structures of heavy masonry built in an era before history began, to endure all the ages of the world. Florid designs were etched so deep into the walls that centuries of tearing sandstorms had failed to obliterate them. The air itself felt fractious and alive with a restless ire. The atmosphere growled as rumbles from the clouds merged with the rising power of the wind. "Don't speak too loudly," murmured the bard as they entered the shadow of the first great tomb. "In case the dead hear ya." They trudged on in nervous silence. It was as bitterly cold as before, but somehow the chill became all the more pernicious, leaching warmth from their bones and hope from their hearts. Leusios was starting to feel the claws of sand himself now. The wind was strong and still growing in force. They all bent against it, protecting their eyes and faces against the slicing grains. He shivered as they passed the next hulking mass of stone, sensing unseen scrutiny from spectral watchers. Shielding his eyes from the sand, Leusios could no longer search the shadows in the gloom, and his imagination began to whisper hints about what could be lurking there. The wind began to moan with the voices of the tombs. The gargantuan structures began to fade behind veils of streaking sand and ice. "We can't go on much longer," Jorwin yelled to Kerne over the wind. "We'll get lost, or separated." The half-orc did not bother trying to reply. He just raised a hand to acknowledge and then waved them towards one of the great structures. A flash of the sickly purple lightning lit up its edifice of stark walls and a pillared entrance. "Here!" Jorwin urged them into the portico of the giant monument. Great bronze doors were set in a deep recess behind 2 rows of columns. It gave them enough space to shelter as the wind began to howl. The world closed in around them as the plain outside filled with a scathing sandstorm flecked with ice. Leusios was shaking and pulled out his share of the firewood in a near panic. He wasn't going to wait for a flint and tinder. "Flarge!" No one commented on his use of magic. They just huddled close and added their own wood to build the fire up. The flames twisted and spun, gathering enough strength to throw up a dance of light and shadow around the ancient walls and pillars. "Wind and weather," muttered Jorwin, forcing good humor. "This is an uncanny place." Kerne grunted in agreement, but no one else spoke until they had eaten. Food and warmth restored them a little, and Leusios felt the penetrating sense of dread recede. Vibnia brewed some nettle tea, and, feeling safe in their sheltered oasis, they watched the storm rage beyond the pillars. Jorwin stood to study the design of the door. "Amazing!" He traced the intricate whirling of lines and shapes with his fingers. "Every bard knows of these tombs. All of us must come here at least once in our lives. Is it the language or just design? Part picture, part sigil. Neither animals nor people. Just secrets long lost. And the doors. Look at where they meet." Jorwin ran a fingernail down the hairline gap. "No handle. Sealed forever. Fashioned of bronze and yet unblemished by all the years." "And no one has dared plunder the riches within?" Vibnia asked. Leusios snorted. "Oh, they dare. They just don't come back. Every few years, some adventurous Durians, seduced by tales of gold and magic, come through Blackstone looking for this place. We warn them, and they laugh at us. We rarely see them again. Those who come back have broken minds." "That's because they've come here for the wrong reasons." Jorwin stroked the door with his hand, using every sense to impress the place upon his memory. "Let us hope that our good intentions protect us, for none should trouble the rest of the good folk." The gathered darkness and ululating wind pressed them close to their fire. Such an atmosphere demanded stories to suit. They shared their tales as the firelight flickered and the storm bellowed like a chorus of the damned. Sealed off from the world by whirling sheets of sand, they spoke of the old lore of the folk who ruled the lands before man and orc. Those who raised cities into the sky and wove magic's expand realities beyond this world. Leusios told a tale of treasures and terror hidden beneath the Blackstone itself, a favorite of the villagers. "I have heard some say that Morka himself is interred there." Jorwin grimaced when he was done. Vibnia snorted. "There are as many tales of what lies beneath the Blackstone as there are Keats alive to tell them." The bard shrugged. "They're not true tales, just rumors and gossip. Not enough to entertain a demanding crowd." He cast his gaze about the spinning sand and darkness. "No, I only know one tale worthy of this time, this place, sitting here in the presence of the elder spirits. The legend of the fire and fall. The good folk were an elder race, also called the Elayna. They were the chosen of Elayna and reigned supreme when the world was young. Yet now they're gone, leaving only a murmur of memories through their monumental edifices here and the circles of stone scattered through the Keetish wilds. How could they fall so entirely? Why was so little left from their era? I tell you now the very words that have been passed from bard to bard, from that time to this. Over 1,000 years, perhaps 2. Throughout that span of forgotten history, humanity has failed to emulate even a spark of the wonder that the world knew under the good folk. Theirs was not civilization, as the Durians claim it to be. No. It was a wonder that only us Keats could genuinely appreciate. Leusios flicked a glance at Vibnia, but the priest was unmoved by the jibe at her compatriots. They had a harmony with all nature, flora, fauna, and elementa sung with one voice. They were neither dependent on a state, nor isolated as individuals. Their society was truly interdependent, made up of equals who valued each other and themselves. They did not have kings, for there were no need for order. They did not have generals, for there was no need for war. They did not have priests, for each one of them was at peace with the divine and the great spirits. The only mark of distinction was true wisdom. No kings are buried in the plain of the elder tombs. This rest place was reserved for those Elayna who had uncovered the deepest mysteries of nature, or developed profound insights into existence. Even the most enlightened must die. But what happens to a spirit that is so replete of understanding when the body fails? And how can a people afford to lose such knowledge? It was for this purpose that the good folk built the great tombs to secure their worthy ancestors within intricate spells and impregnable walls. Then they constructed a tower in a high place to watch over them all and ensure that we lesser folk, humans and orcs, did not disturb their rest. They called it Tirister for its wondrous view of the stars. Lucius saw Kerne's eyes snap into focus, and the half-orc opened his mouth, but then closed it rather than interrupt. All around the tombs, they planted the most wondrous gardens, Jorwin continued, and its steward was called the Morbos. This office sowed a single seed of disharmony, for in a society of equals, the Morbos had unprecedented access to the knowledge of ages. For many generations, there was no upset, and an Elayna generation is many lifespans for us mortals. The flaw remained unrealized because the good stewards guarded the wise dead selflessly. They were chosen for their skills at tending the gardens within and spell wards without. Thus, for millennia, the lesser folk, humans and orcs, lived out their fleeting lives in ignorance of this place. Then there came a steward called Atraxian. He was as good as his predecessors at minding the gardens and wards, but he had a flaw: curiosity. As he spoke to the spirits, he began to imagine where such knowledge could lead. He may have had access to the wisdom of millennia, but was not himself wise. Not content with his span of life and surrounded by death, he asked a question that no Morbos had ever asked before. Could those who had passed into death tell him how to cheat it? His people were dismayed and cautioned him. Jorwin paused to briefly lock eyes with Leusios. That such a path was against the natural order. Leusios returned the bard's gaze without flinching. Now, what he lacked in wisdom, Jorwin continued, Atraxian made up for in cunning. He pretended to bow to their will, while secretly trying to fulfill his ambition to become Rewankal, the Lord of Death. He built a fortress and called it Brekendri to protect his work. Next, he stirred up a storm of lacerating crystals to bar entry to the tombs, so he alone could hoard the knowledge. Jorwin twirled his hands toward the sandstorm outside their little pool of firelight. Though the curse no longer strips flesh from bone, his power still haunts the plane of the elder tombs to this day. Listen. He raised a hand to his ear and half closed his eyes in concentration. Aye, if you attend carefully, you can still hear his malign chant in the height of the wind. Leusios felt a shiver go down his back. He was sure he couldn't hear the cursed voice, but his imagination strung together enough sounds to say otherwise. He hugged his knees closer. Jorwin opened his eyes and paused as a streak of lightning sent a diffused flicker of purple light through the blizzard of sand and ice. The rumble of thunder followed several heartbeats later, muted beneath the howl of the wind. The bard nodded, as if he caught and understood the words in the storm. Aye, he knew that his fellows would act when they discovered his treachery, so he prepared for conflict. The first since the mythic age of tears. He taught humans and orcs the ways of war, and forever polluted their spirits with a love of fighting. Thus, he created an army to keep his kin at bay. The Elayna discovered his duplicity, and now they knew a great anger. Like a Durian monk sworn against alcohol, one swallow from the chalice of ire, and they were intoxicated with a terrible fury. They raised their own army of humans and orcs, and they constructed 2 great flying citadels from which to command their army. They were Cressic Gwynleden and Cressic Duodoran, their white and black citadels. Seeing this overwhelming force coming upon him, the Morbos worked a mighty and terrible magic. With a storyteller's cunning, Jorwin had discreetly gathered a handful of ash from the edge of the fire. With a theatrical flourish, he cast it upwards and conjured a cloud that made them flinch away. It filled the air with a haze that took on a glow of the fire, casting everything in a hellish red light. He boomed in a terrible voice. The sky turned red, and the sun was blotted out. His arms swept through the dust cloud, making it swirl. Death came upon the land in a rain of fire, and all beauty was marred black. The Elayna citadels were broken and cast down from the sky, while both armies were scattered like chaff in a wild gale. The magic of the foolish Morbos was so terrible that it consumed him. The castle of Brekendri was pulverized, its stones crushed to dust and blown beyond the edges of the world. Aye, even the boundaries of our reality tore, and horrors flooded into a night that lasted 100 years. In battles unnumbered and wars unnamed, the light of the Elayna was lost forever. In the grey dawn that followed, humans and orcs were left alone in a land that was charred and scarred. They held their silence for a while, listening to the wrath of the storm. Leusios was first to speak, but only in a whisper. Why did Atraxian cast a spell that would destroy himself? It was hubris, Jorwin declared. He called Tani Bren the Skyfire. The tales tell us that it was destruction made flesh. It was a power beyond his own reckoning that he could not control. Leusios felt his stomach knot. He remembered the feeling of twice being on the brink of destruction as magic had sought to consume him. He looked down at his boots in case anyone saw his reaction. He was desperate to change the subject. Earlier you talked of stone circles in the forest. Yes, carved and shaped so eternal stone was in harmony with ephemeral nature. Most have fallen and been covered by centuries upon centuries of leaf litter and forest loam. There are stones like that on top of Elwith's Rock. Really? Jorwin's bardic aloofness softened in curiosity. "The high rock you can see above the treetops from the market round?" "Yes, it's a meeting place." Leusios had been there many times and couldn't help a little grin. "For lovers." Kerne spoke softly, still captivated by Jorwin's tale. "The orcs say that their god, Awoken, overthrew the ancients and created a world where they would always roam free and have their strength tested every day, so only the strong would survive." "They are as godless as the animals," observed Vibnia curtly, making Kerne stiffen. "There is no god but the divine, and no godlings save the spirits who serve at the pleasure of the Evermighty."
"And the one that doesn't," muttered Leusios. He glanced out into the turbulent darkness. On nights like this, one could not help but be aware of Morka's power.
Vibnia was studying Kerne. "What I have said is the truth," she stated, daring him to challenge her. "After so long in the monastery, were a few years among your orc kin enough to make you doubt all you have been taught about the corpus vigilos?"
Kerne was not taken aback by Vibnia's forthright question. Leusios watched the half-orc nod sagely, as if he had pondered that very question often. "When first we met, I told you that humanity was not just about blood, but an ideal. It is not innate. We must strive towards this ideal. This central tenet of the corpus vigilos I hold to. The orcish ways lacks compassion, and yet I am not convinced that the corpus has the full answer to what the human ideal is. Jorwin's story and the legends that the orc shamans tell me must come from the same shared myth." Vibnia's manner became steely as she prepared to fight for her beliefs.
"The corpus is the ultimate form of compassion. We would willingly give our lives to protect humanity."
"Once you refer to giving and taking of lives, then compassion is already lost," Kerne retorted. So the argument went on. Leusios found it fascinating. Two companions whom he had struggled to understand now laid themselves bare. Vibnia was a woman driven by her divinely inspired mission to protect humanity from the evils of the world. In contrast, Kerne spoke with incomplete ideas. Sometimes floundering, he nevertheless showed that he had thought about such things deeply and was still exploring them. Without clear answers, it was as if part of the argument was with Vibnia and part with himself. This half-man, half-beast clung to a belief that there was goodness and natural justice in the world for all. A naive dream, as far as Leusios was concerned. He was not convinced how strong a grip Kerne had on the idea either. He saw doubt hovering in the half-orc's eyes, and even a fragility he had never seen before. Kerne had a weakness. Jorwin's hand jerked up. "Hush!" "What?" Leusios started to say, and then clamped his jaws tight. The tension building in him throughout Jorwin's tale returned tenfold when he heard the rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats. "Who could be out in this?" Leusios asked so softly none of the others heard him. He and Kerne turned from their firelight to peer through the pillars and into the storm. A rider wrapped in black on an ebony horse plunged through the furies of sand. The horse lathered with coursing energy that sparked as it galloped through the tearing wind. As it passed them, the hooded head turned briefly towards their fire. The ruddy glow of the firelight caught and slithered over a mask of black iron. Then rider and steed plunged onwards and were soon lost from sight. Then came the shrieking. Leusios at first mistook the apparition for a whirl of sand catching the light of their fire. But then a spectre of hate surged towards them like the fury of the storm personified. Its translucent skull blazed with a crown of sickly green light, and its robes swirled like putrid vapors. Terror struck Leusios deep. He screamed and jumped back. Kerne tried to draw his sword, but a skeletal hand materialized from the ghostly tumult and tossed him aside like a doll. Vibnia's quick fingers strung her bow and loosed an arrow. It passed through the horror and into the night. Leusios backed against the great doors, rigid with fear, certain that the spectral eyes directed all their hatred at him. An emaciated hand pointed a claw at his chest.
The stink of the dragon is amongst you. The taint of bound destruction.
The screeching pronouncement froze his guts. Then Jorwin stood forth, his magnificent spear raised.
Hithwin Inon, peace, old one. You no longer belong in this world.
The leaf-like blade ignited in a blaze of golden light, and the phantom recoiled with a wail of frustration.
Gwaewa course! You would deny me by bearing our own against me? Enur Radthas, away, please, I beg you,
Jorwin pleaded. The spirit twisted left and right, trying to get past the bard as he shifted the radiant spearhead to match it. Vibnia raised her circle pendant.
Back, phantom. You will have no satisfaction or peace here.
It hissed in frustration and withdrew to the edge of their shelter.
The rot is rife beneath your feet,
it seethed.
Tan Ibran Yama Adragan. Sanctuaries are defiled, mountains bleed, the air chokes, and all that is good corrupts. Wielding skyfire, there is no victor, just victims.
It deliberately swept its talons over each of them in turn, like a wordless curse, until it raised its hand to Kerne. The half-orc was warily rising to his feet, nursing his wrist. The spectre paused. Its sickly colors shifted to melancholic blues and purples. Its voice softened.
The horn sounds, son of Elayna,
it whispered and began to back off.
What?
How can you know? Shouted Kerne. Who are you?
Tomorrow, Balgwelez, our halls await your coming. But so does the tainted soul imprisoned there. Beware.
It drifted into the storm, letting its vaporous form be swept away in the streaming sands. Gone. The storm may have been bellowing around them, but the portico of the tomb returned to an oasis of eerie calm. Leusios swallowed a whimper and let his back slide down the face of the bronze doors until he sat on the stone floor.
What rank demonry was that?
Something of no threat to those with faith, Vibnia observed pointedly.
Bless you, Jorwin.
She pulled out her flask and unstoppered it for a hefty swig. Jorwin stared into the storm where the spectre had disappeared.
Your faith and mine are put in different things, Vibnia. That was no demon. We are in a place that is ancient. If the world had a song, then our human definition of years would only be the last line of the last verse. I suspect the writer disturbed one of the interred spirits. Aye. Tonight we saw legend become reality.
The bard's lips worked through other words, but he left them hidden in his private thoughts.
The writer.
Lucius's thoughts turned to the figure wrapped in black.
Could it have been Kulain?
Vibnia shook her head.
No, he does not own a horse. No one owns a horse like that. Did the spirit's words make any sense to you, Kerne?
Kerne massaged his wrist and flexed his fingers.
Maybe. But it doesn't matter right now. We have the hardest fight of our lives tomorrow, and that is all that should concern us. It has gone, so I suggest we sleep.
Sleep? Leusios couldn't imagine sleeping right now.
I'll take first watch.
The others settled down with an ease that annoyed him. How did they do it? He pondered the question as he stared into the gale of razor-sharp sand from their island of stillness. Vibnia had her unequivocal belief in the mission of the Corpus Vigilos. Jorwin drew his certainty from centuries of bardic lore and the natural order. Even Kerne, for all his groping toward some definition of faith, had the firm foundation of his physical prowess. Did he, Leusios, have such a source of strength? His heart was still hammering and his skin was cold with sweat.
When had he ever been as scared as that? The mage hound? No. He had read the spectre's intent in its terrible eyes. More than his life had been at stake. The spirit had wanted to rip out his soul. All the more reason why he had to succeed tomorrow. His hand went to the last 2 bottles of essence secured inside his coat. Tomorrow he would safeguard his destiny of magic and power. Garantos and his bandits would die. That ends Chapter 9, The Elder Tombs. Finally, battle is at hand. Kerne and the party face daunting odds. Will surprise be enough to turn the tide, save Teneus, and defeat the bandits? And amidst the chaos of battle, will Leusios fulfill his deadly intent? Find out next week. If you enjoyed this episode, why not like, subscribe, and recommend it to your friends?